everyone, and welcome back to the long-awaited return to the Harry Potter review series, Part 3. This has been a long time coming, and thanks in part to technical difficulties and life itself rearing its ugly head, I had to put this series off for quite some time. I mean, it wasn't that long, was it? Well, I guess it was a while. Sorry about that. Damn, time does fly. It feels like just yesterday I was doing this. Anyway, regardless, this series will consist of the handheld Potter tiles, which up front I'm going to tell you I have never played before in my life. Hell, I have never even seen footage of these games before playing them now, and it's probably why I was so against getting right into the series right after I'd finished the second part of the series of Harry Potter reviews, because I'd always been familiar with the first main 8, because that's what I played, because I always played the console versions, but I never really done some of the other ones I looked at in Part 2. Yeah, I dabbled in the Lego games, the Quidditch game, whatever, I had some stuff to say, but I really had like a personal experience with all those games, whereas with the handhelds that I knew everyone wanted me to look at, I never played them, so you're really expecting me to play something and then immediately have a lot to say about it. So I really had to open my mind up when I was looking at these to kind of make an opinion. So yeah, long story short, I never played the handheld since I felt like the console games were just better since you could explore Hogwarts more openly, and I'm going to be very honest with you here, they look loads better. And I was young, and I was biased, and anything that looked like this compared to, this, was obviously going to win in my book. But don't worry, because I spent a great deal of time with these games now, obviously it's been so long, and I've kept a real good open mind. So without any further ado, let us dive back into the world of Harry Potter video games with Sorcerer's Stone on the Game Boy Color. So the plot follows the events from the book, and in fact compared to how the PlayStation and Xbox told the tale, I would say that the Game Boy Color follows the plot a tad closer than those versions in some cases. For one, the game actually starts with Harry and Hagrid at Diagon Alley getting supplies, which was strangely skipped over in the other versions, and actually was one of the first points I made in my original Sorcerer's Stone review about why you couldn't just start the game at Diagon Alley. Even weirder when that game had Diagon Alley in it, just at a different point. So, bonus points for this already. After that, we see Harry and Ron on board the Hogwarts Express, meeting Hermione, Neville, and their first encounter with Malfoy. Again, all of this was not even summed up in the opening narration of the other game. Most of the scenes contain dialogue ripped straight from the novel, and that's adding to the authenticity, which I love. After sorting, the game sidetracks into the showing how the trio attends classes before adding in the Midnight Duel, which was cut from not only the other games, but in the film as well, strangely enough. I actually don't know why they decided the Midnight Duel was a bad idea. I mean, it got them out of bed and got them to see Fluffy, but the movie just has them in the staircase and moving. Oh, okay, Chris, you're not reviewing the movies, you're reviewing the game. No, Part 4 will not be reviewing the movies, because I'll get copyright infringement and flagged immediately if I start reviewing those. Maybe we'll find a workaround. Anyway, after that we get the troll battle at Halloween, Harry getting his invisibility cloak, finding the Mirror of Erised, Hagrid hatching Norbert, the trio having to give the dragon off to Ron's brother Charlie, the detention in the Forbidden Forest, and finally the traps guarding the stone, in which, like the PlayStation game, they're all ripped straight from the book rather than the film, so the ones that were missing, they're back. It follows everything except for the Quidditch match, as Quidditch is completely absent from this game, even though the pitch can be seen in the corner. Bonus points for adding it in there, I guess. Overall, it's a faithful adaptation, though the only real flaw, I guess, would be that the plot doesn't really bother to bulk out the narrative too much, which you kind of think it would. Though I'll give it, again, like I said, bonus points for including a ton of scenes that from the beginning that were absent from the other games. The first hour has you exploring Diagon Alley, Gringotts, the Hogwarts Express, and even the lake and entranceways to Hogwarts, which is better than nothing, which is exactly what we got in the other versions. Though there is a small part near the middle where the game gives you a class list with the freedom to pick wherever you want to go, and each one presents a small little side quest. It gives more screen time to Peeves and Professor Binns, even if their plotlines are not exactly from the book, but at least their characters are right in line with what we remember. But other than this small little side trip on the plot railroad, it bends back exceedingly fast and then just follows the rest of the main beats of the story. So now you're probably wondering, if the console games were adventure, platform, puzzle games, how will the Game Boy Color adapt that kind of a gameplay? Well, Sorcerer's Stone goes in for a completely unexpected direction, making the game a role-playing game complete with random battles and a turn-based battle system. Harry now has stats that will raise when he gains levels, and you can even equip items to help raise the stats as well. The base stats to worry about here are stamina, magic, strength, defense, agility, and magic defense. The items that you can equip can be attached to your head, your hand, your belt, your body, and shoes. Early in the game when you're at Diagon Alley, you can buy a bunch of these items to help you start the game off with good stats. However, once you're at Hogwarts, you're going to have to either find random pieces of equipment around the school, or pray that they get dropped from the enemies. I felt it was weird not to have a place to buy equipment in an RPG, though then again I also felt it might have been weird having a store in Hogwarts selling these things. That might have been a bit odd, though the simple fix of that might have been just to have Harry be able to return to Diagon Alley at will to buy more stuff. Instead, you only get to go back to Diagon Alley once, and it's kind of near the start of the game, so it might not even be worth buying anything else if you already purchased the best stuff the first time you were here, which was probably about, 10 minutes ago? Honestly, I spent most of the game with the base equipment I'd gotten at the start, and I was fine. Another weird thing is how the game handles the concept of being a role-playing game with a turn-based battle system. At the start of the game, it seems to be making a conscious choice regarding this type of gameplay. You enter Diagon Alley, and it's a place to talk with witches and wizards and buy supplies, acting similarly to a town in any RPG. When you go into Gringotts to get to Harry's vault, you get separated from Hagrid and you must fight your way to find him, and you fight off rats on your way there, and then you fight a giant rat near the end. So it's kind of like a dungeon with a boss at the end. Again, a design form used in, 99% of role-playing games? This continues until you reach Hogwarts and must explore the lake and the dungeons. Each area is kind of like a maze to explore, and a hard enemy type at the end. However, once you get to Hogwarts itself, the game kind of abandons that design in a way. Instead, you move from area to area in the school, and small enemy types pop up with few boss encounters. You're also free to skip all these fights since the game never forces you into most fights. And honestly, you can skip all the damn fights because the endgame is so rigged in your favor I couldn't believe it, but I'll explain more on that in a bit. When you enter battle, you'll be attacking with magic, and you get several spells at the start of the game from one of Harry's spellbooks. You start with Flipendo and Vermilius. Using the spells and leveling Harry up unlocks different levels of the spell at the Duo and Trio level, which inflict more damage. You gain spells sometimes from classes, and sometimes from just exploring around Hogwarts. However, there is a bit of a weird system in place when it comes to the battle system and the spells. So, in a traditional RPG, say Final Fantasy, you have a bunch of weapons and spells to attack the baddies with, right? And based on what weapon stats and character stats, your weapon will deal a set number of damage. And depending on if the enemy you're fighting is weak to something you have equipped, you might do a little more damage or a little less damage. But regardless, damage will be given in some capacity. In Sorcerer's Stone, there is a weird system in place for some enemies. When you hit enemies with a spell that's not its weakness, you'll either do 0 damage or 1. However, hit them with the right spell and you do max damage at like 39, 40, 50, crazy numbers. I understand that the other spell isn't their weakness, but just 1 point of damage? It also doesn't help that when there's 3 of the same enemies on the screen and you go to use the trio spells, which takes loads of magic points, and you learn the hard way that it's not their weakness when it does 3 points of damage or 0 across the board. I mean, was it too much to ask for a little more damage? Say if like a weakness spell dealt 40 and the not correct spell dealt 20, doesn't that seem a little bit more fair? Though even when you hit them with the correct spell, sometimes it does 0 since it's resisted. Though this happens when enemies hit Harry, so I really can't complain fully on that one. It's a shame because in early sections the combat is fun and the different level spells and taking out all the enemies is a satisfying gameplay loop. The middle of the game is a struggle as you try to memorize which enemies are weak to what spell so you pick the right one and not waste magic points. Though thankfully there are like 10 enemies in the game all around. You got your spiders, your plants, your gnomes, your rats. Good lord, does Hogwarts have a friggin' rat problem? The other issue is the fact that 2 of the spells are remarkably similar in name, so good luck trying to remember whether it was Vermilius or Verdimilius in some cases. Sometimes the enemy has a different color selector next to it, but I can't tell what the hell it means, and I even googled up the manual to see if maybe the color meant something to clue me in, but I didn't see it explain that, so I think it's just random. The last part of the battling system is the potion making and the Folio Triplicus. After attending Herbology, you get to use all the strange pickups that you've been amassing since the start of the game in a potion mixing section on the menu to make potions to replenish health and magic points. You can find recipes around the school to mix more things, but I actually never even used the potion making feature since there's so many enemies that drop so many of these replenishing items, in addition to these items just being hidden around Hogwarts on its own. In a strange twist, the famous Witches and Wizards cards are actually tied into a feature in the battle system rather than just being collectibles. You'll still find the cards scattered all over the place, though this time you can find doubles as you can use them in combat. The Folio Triplicus allows 3 cards to be used to create a unique fight bonus. Sometimes it can give you more strength, or deflect damage, or in one case, make the enemy stronger, because that just seems like a batshit thing to want to do. You can find these combinations during the main story, by completing tasks, and by searching around the school. However, while this is an interesting feature, and would seem to exist to make boss fights a little bit easier in some cases, it's almost completely useless. I used it twice in the whole game, and I never felt the need to look into it or use it ever again, even during the boss fights, and that's thanks in part to a little flaw the game has and how it punishes you for losing fights. So, what does happen when Harry bites the bullet? Is it back to the title screen to reload your last save point, or maybe the game returns you to the start of an area with none of the experience you gained? Well, it doesn't do any of that. Instead, once you arrive at Hogwarts when you die, you respawn in the hospital wing, which makes sense, but you have all of the experience that you gained up until the point you died. It's easy to create leveling up farming spots where you fight for a little bit, die, respawn, then do it again until you level up enough. The worst of this, the damned worst of this, is the final battles at the end of the game. The end of the game presents 5 fights before Voldemort. First it's against the Devil's Snare, then 3 chess pieces, because of course this is the 3rd iteration of the chess scene, and at this point I just knew we weren't ever going to play actual chess. I mean, that would be too easy and obvious, so whatever, I'm not expecting it anymore. And then finally Quirrell. When I reached this point, I was about level 38, and I felt like that was a decent level. I'd been doing pretty good so far with everything up to this point, and while I was fighting in these challenges, everything felt well. I mean, it was taking a couple of hits to down the enemies, but I felt like this was the final challenge, so it's gotta be harder, right? And then Voldemort showed up, and he starts throwing spells that are doing 3-digit damage. Mind you, no other boss has done that up to this point. He's just chucking out a 150 spell. So even with my health of 300, 3 hits of this is wiping the floor with me. And in this case, the game doesn't bring me to the hospital wing, but rather right outside the door to Fluffy, where I gotta do all the challenges again. And it was at this point that I wondered if I'd lost all my experience from the fights in an area, since all the fights here tend to give you over 600 to 1,000 points of experience, and it's pretty much good for an instant level up when you defeat one. Well, after making my way back to Quirrell, I realized that the game does in fact let you keep all of the experience after you die. And now I'm pretty sure you all figured out what I did next. So yeah, I spent the next 10 minutes redoing the section over and over and over and over again, and because I was playing this on an emulator, I was able to speed it up, so what would have probably taken about 30 minutes of real time took about 10. While also doing this, I found out that some of the final enemies also dropped the game's best equipment to raise Harry's stats, which also made this easy. So like I said, after the 10 minutes, Harry went from level 38 to 67. And now with a ton of health, and complete with a spell that can poison Voldemort 20 points of damage each turn, the final battle was in the bag. The final fight renders all the optional fights pointless. The equipment given to you right here at the end, so there's no need to find anything before you come down here, and finally the Folio Triplicus is not even needed. The game really needed a bigger penalty for losing fights. I mean, imagine any other role-playing game where you continuously gain levels while trying to get to a boss, die during said boss, and then get to keep all your progress and try again. It's a shame because I really like the idea of a Harry Potter role-playing game, and the early hours were fun and engaging. I actually did like it. But by the end, there were more holes in the battle system than Swiss cheese. I get that the game is based on a movie and it's aimed at kids, but this is like baby's first RPG. Die in a fight? Don't worry, you can keep all the experience gained. Can't collect all the wizards and witches cards to get a better battle bonus? Don't worry, you don't even have to use that feature. Can't afford the better equipment or find better ones? Relax, the final enemies of the game will drop the best stuff you've been given to access in hours. I get the feeling that the game was originally just a straightforward fetch quest kind of a game where Harry just goes to a place, collects an item, attends classes, and then they just were like, let's throw a bare bones RPG system on top of that and call it a day. Another little flaw I found, although this was more of a personal pet peeve on my mind, was how the game only has Harry fighting battles on his own. True, for most of the game Harry is alone, and granted the ending fights against Voldemort were always going to be solo, just from a story perspective. But even when Hermione, Ron, and Neville and other characters are walking around with you, it's still just you in the battles. And I feel like this was a huge misstep not to include any of them as party members. Though granted how easy and dented the battle system mechanics become, I guess maybe it was better it was just Harry. Though fighting alone against 3 enemies can be overwhelming at times, and if you're spending too much time guessing which spell will work on top of praying to the gods that your spell's going to randomly hit instead of resisting and taking 0, enemies can take you out in a flash, though that flash will quickly be followed by you waking up in the hospital wing and then racing back down to where you were and moving on. Aside from the battle system, there's a few mini-games to take part in as you progress through the game. There's 3 flying sections, 2 of which are side-scrolling, in which you guide Harry around projectiles to reach a target, and these are used to catch Malfoy when he steals the Remember Roll, and later in an added scene where Norbert escapes Hagrid's hut. The last one is a vertical side-scrolling section to reach the winged key, which is at the top of the screen. The side-scrolling ones are decent if a tad simplistic, but how else was the Game Boy Color going to handle flying sections? And the winged key section is just too random for its own good. You make your way up to the top, but anytime you get hit, you fall down a bit, and it's easy to get into a loop where you'll just constantly keep falling over and over and over again. The potion section guarding the stone is turned into a guess the ingredient, where you get 12 shots to figure it out, and each time you take a shot at one of the icons, you get told whether it's right or not. The Charms class is the last type of minigame, where as opposed to the other classes where they just hand out the spell like it was candy, Charms is similar to what was seen in the PlayStation game, in which you have to follow a pattern that Flitwick performs. And I'm not sure if my memory is not as strong as it used to be back in the day, but I just couldn't keep this pattern in my head. I just had to write it down because it was just insane by the end. The final aspect of the game is collecting house points, which has a different ending if you don't gain enough, despite how the book ended in this case. So as we all know, Gryffindor wins, thanks to Dumbledore giving out the points to Harry, Ron, Hermione, and Neville, which does happen here. However, if you still didn't have enough points to start with and Slytherin wins, Dumbledore says that despite the added points, it doesn't matter, and Slytherin wins. And then several members of Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff burn your ass in the funniest pieces of dialogue I've ever seen in these games. Honestly, I would just get this ending over the real one, just because of how funny it is. Presentation is solid for a late Game Boy Color game, though from what I heard, playing this one on the actual hardware was a bit of a struggle, especially without a backlight, because the night sections where the screen goes dark make it impossible to see. The character sprites are detailed and have some nice animations, like when Harry jumps in the victory animations, or when a character has to move around the screen in a slightly unique way. The character portraits in the dialogue windows are nicely detailed, if a tad pixelated for some of the characters. The music is fitting, complete with MIDI recreations of Jeremy Soul's themes from the PlayStation game. As for the design areas of the film, well, it's a bit touch and go in that department. I get the feeling that the people that designed the backgrounds either didn't get a chance to see the concept from the film at this point, or rather it was too hard to recreate aspects from the film design, because a good chunk of here is totally original, and almost like someone on the team read the book and tried to recreate the environments from what was in their own head after maybe like 12 beers. The character sprites are spot on, as are locations like Hagrid's hut, Gringotts, and the outside of the Quidditch pitch, but everything else is kind of too original for its own good. I mean, it does help give the game its own identity, but there's sometimes when you'll be walking around and you'll see things that just kind of feel like they belong in like another type of a game and like it was a used asset. I mean, take a look at the picture of the fat lady here. I mean, there's like no effort at all to try to get that looking like the thing from the movie, like not even a close representation, but you know, hardware's hardware and there's only so much you can do. It's fine for what it is. Also, if you play the game on a big TV like I did using the emulator, try to sit back as far as possible as you can, since these sprites and environments were never meant to be scaled up to a giant flat screen TV size. Overall, I felt that the Game Boy Color version of Sorcerer's Stone was a bit of a mixed bag, and something that resembled a roller coaster. It started off well enough, keeping expectations at an elevated level before plummeting down and never really reaching the same height again. I was interested in the fact that the game was trying to be built around the mechanics of an RPG, and in the early hours, like I said before, it felt like the game could embrace those mechanics. But then it just feels like the wheels flew off. The game has a bunch of mechanics for combat and leveling, but due to the poor balancing, none of it makes any real difference in the long run. Want to not fight anything for the later part of the game? Go nuts, because the final battles become insanely easy. You could keep looping in your gained experience each time you fail. Miss out on a spell or a combination card? Don't worry, because you don't even need them. It's a shame because the pieces are all here. Different levels of powerful spells, equipments to raise stats, combat bonuses. On paper it should all work, but the simple fact is that the game doesn't punish you for dying and allows you to constantly keep leveling, so it renders everything else superfluous. I kinda wish the game made each class have its own challenge room with a boss at the end. Also helping probably would have been a store, maybe run by Fred and George, who sell you equipment, or again, like I said before, the game just could have given you access to Diagon Alley at any time to get better equipment. But the biggest change would have to be having you restart at the last save point, or a checkpoint of sorts where you can respawn without experience having been collected. With these features implemented, the game would have been able to use those RPG elements to their full potential. In the end, I felt like the game was an average experience with the lackluster RPG mechanics. It does a decent attempt to follow the plot of the book, though. I'm in no rush to return to it and give it another go, nor is there any reason to play beyond the credits. If you're interested in seeing how they adapted Sorcerer's Stone to the Game Boy Color, then I say it's worth a look. I just couldn't help but be disappointed by the overall result, since the early hours had a lot of promise. So join us next time when the Harry Potter review series continues as we come back to look at the other version of Sorcerer's Stone, this time on the Game Boy Advance. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.